My wife told everyone I had abandoned our family. She had no idea that our 14-year-old daughter had been watching the whole time. I want to start with a bridge. Not metaphorically, an actual bridge. The Ride Bridge over the Parramatta River, which I worked on for 18 months in 2011, and which carries about 40,000 vehicles a day, and which I have driven across maybe 300 times since it opened, and which, every single time, I feel in my chest in a way that I have never been able to explain adequately to anyone who does not build things for a living. It is not pride, exactly. Pride is too simple for it. It is something more like the satisfaction of a proof, the specific, deep satisfaction of a thing that is standing and bearing load and doing what it was designed to do, in weather and traffic and the long grinding wear of years, because the calculations were right and the materials were right, and the people who built it knew what they were doing and did not cut corners. It is the satisfaction of something that was not there, and then was there, and has continued to be there every day since. I am Callum Byrne. I am 44 years old, and I am a civil engineer, and I have spent my professional life building infrastructure in New South Wales, bridges, retaining structures, drainage systems, the unremarkable functional backbone of a city that most people use every day without thinking about. I grew up in Blacktown, the son of Irish immigrants who had come to Western Sydney in 1978 with the specific combination of ambition and practicality that tends to produce people who build things rather than people who talk about building things. My father was a concreter. My mother ran the books for 3 small businesses and raised 2 sons, and never once suggested that hard work was anything other than the baseline expectation. I am not a complicated person. I want to say that clearly, not as a disclaimer, but as a fact, because the story I am going to tell you has some complicated elements in it, and I want you to understand who is telling it. I am a man who believes in showing up, who believes that reliability is a form of love, that presence is a form of respect, that the most important things you do for the people you care about are not the dramatic gestures, but the consistent ones, the ordinary, unremarkable, daily accumulation of being there. I held this belief for 14 years of marriage. I held it through the difficult years, through the years when Rachel and I were finding our way back to each other after a period of distance that we had both contributed to and both tried to repair. I held it in the therapist's office on Thursdays, and in the kitchen at 7 in the morning making lunches, and in the car in the school drop-off line in Chatswood, and in the hospital in 2021 when Mia broke her wrist and I sat with her for 6 hours while Rachel was in court and couldn't get away. I held it because I believed it was real, and because the alternative, the admission that you have been present for a life that the other person did not notice, was not something I was prepared to hold. Then I read an email that Rachel had sent to our friends, and the holding became something different. Rachel Byrne is one of the most capable people I have ever known. I want to say this without equivocation because capability is not the same as character, and understanding what Rachel could do is essential to understanding what she did. She is a family lawyer, has been for 15 years, which means she has spent her professional life understanding the architecture of marriages at the moment they fail. She knows how assets are divided and how custody is determined, and what evidence courts find compelling and what they find irrelevant. She knows in a way that most people who have not worked in family law do not know, that the story of a marriage, who was present, who contributed, who loved more carefully, is not recorded in any official document until the marriage ends, and that when it ends, whoever tells the story most convincingly in the right room usually wins. She knew all of this when we married. I did not think about the implications of that for 13 years. What I knew for 13 years was the version of Rachel that I had loved since we met at a work function in 2008. The woman who walked into a room with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place in it. who had opinions about everything and had thought through each of them, who laughed at things that were actually funny rather than things that were socially expected to be funny, who was with Mia in a way that I had always found deeply moving, present, attentive, genuinely curious about who her daughter was becoming. That version of Rachel was real. I want to be clear about that too, because I think it matters. Because the mistake of stories like this one is to make the person who did the harm into someone who was always only that, who was a villain from the beginning, who never genuinely loved the things they damaged. I don't believe that is true. I believe Rachel loved our family. I believe she loved me for a significant portion of our marriage, in the genuine way of someone who has chosen a person and committed to the choice. What I also believe is that Rachel's understanding of love was shaped, in ways she may not have fully examined, by a lifetime of professional experience in rooms where love ended and what remained was negotiation. She had watched marriages dissolve for 15 years. She had watched what happened when people were unprepared, when they had not protected themselves, had not documented, had not thought about the structural realities of the thing they were in until the structure was failing. She had represented clients on both sides of every kind of dispute that a marriage's ending can produce. And at some point, I cannot tell you exactly when, cannot identify the specific day or conversation where it happened, she had begun to apply that professional knowledge to her own situation. To think about us not only as a marriage, but as a legal arrangement. To consider what her position would look like if the arrangement ended. The signs were there. I'm honest enough to admit that now. The Thursday evenings, she said she was working late but came home without the specific tired quality of someone who has been in a difficult case. The weekend, last August, when she was on her phone more than usual in the way of someone managing something that required careful management. The money, the slow, incremental shift in our joint account balance that I had noticed and attributed to increased household expenses and had not investigated because investigating felt like distrust, and I was not ready to distrust her. I noticed, and I explained. I noticed, and I waited. I noticed, and I held on to what I believed to be true, which is what you do when you have decided that a marriage is worth fighting for, and you don't yet know that only one person has made that decision. There was one conversation in the spring of last year that I have returned to many times. We were in the garden after dinner, a Sydney autumn evening of the particular quality that makes the city feel like the best version of itself. Warm, but not oppressive, the light going golden in the late afternoon, the kind of evening that makes you feel that everything is fine, even when it isn't. Mia was inside doing homework. Rachel was looking at the garden with an expression I could not read. She said, "Do you think we're happy?" I looked at her. It was not the question itself that registered. It was the quality of it, the specific tone of someone asking a question they have been sitting with for some time and have finally decided to say aloud. The question of someone who has already, to some extent, answered it. "I think we could be," I said. "I think we're working toward it." She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked back at the garden. "Yes," she said. "I suppose." I thought afterward that it had been a good conversation. I thought we had said something true to each other, and that was a foundation for the next conversation and the one after. I did not understand that it was, in retrospect, the last conversation we had where Rachel was still asking rather than deciding. 4 months later, she filed. The documents arrived on a Monday in March. I was at the kitchen table when I saw the envelope, the return address of a legal firm I did not recognize, the formal weight of it in my hand, the specific quality of dread that arrives before you have opened the thing but have understood from its shape what it contains. I opened it, I read it. I read it again. The papers were thorough and professional, the work of someone who knew what they were doing. They laid out Rachel's grounds for dissolution, her request for primary custody of Mia on the basis of Callum's frequent professional absences and emotional unavailability, her claim on the family home and its contents, her proposed financial settlement. The language was precise and impersonal, the language of legal documents that are describing your life in the way that legal documents describe things, accurately in the technical sense and in no other sense that matters. I put the papers on the table. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden where we had sat last autumn, and I thought about the question she had asked me. Do you think we're happy? And I understood now what it had been. Not a real question. A marker. A point in the timeline that would later be referenced as evidence of a marriage that had been struggling, that she had tried to address, that had not responded. She had been building a record in her own way before she left, and that conversation in the garden had been part of it. The email came 40 minutes later. It was from Rachel's personal account, sent to a list of addresses that included every significant person in our shared social world. Colleagues, friends, the parents of Mia's school friends, the people who would constitute the community context of whatever came next. It was, as a piece of writing, accomplished. It was warm and sad and carefully positioned. Rachel describing the decision to separate as something she had arrived at after considerable reflection, expressing gratitude for the support of friends, and noting, with the specific delicacy of someone who wants something said without appearing to want it said, that the marriage had suffered from Callum's difficulty being fully present for the family, and his tendency to withdraw emotionally during difficult periods. I read it at the kitchen table. I want to tell you what it felt like to read a version of your marriage written by the person who had been in it with you, that you did not recognize. Not because it was entirely false. I had withdrawn during difficult periods. I knew that about myself. I had been working on it with Dr. Harris for 2 years, and it was something I was genuinely trying to address. But the version in the email used those real and partial truths as load-bearing elements of a structure that supported a conclusion they did not actually support. I had withdrawn and then returned. I had been absent and then more present. I had made mistakes and had been working on them. The email presented the withdrawal without the return, the absence without the presence, the mistakes without the repair. It was the work of someone who understood exactly which facts to include and which to omit. I sat with it for a long time. Then, and I want to tell you why I did this because it matters, I picked up my phone and I opened the app. It was called Family Hub. I had started using it in the first year of our marriage, initially as a shared calendar for Rachel and me, the way young professional couples manage the logistics of 2 full schedules, and it had expanded over the years into something more comprehensive. A shared family record. Schedules and appointments and medical notes and school communications and the small, constant administrative tissue of a family's life. I had been the primary keeper of it. Rachel had used it, but I had been the one who updated it consistently, who added notes and records and photographs, who had, over 11 years, built in it a kind of archive of the practical life of our family. I scrolled back. I went back to 2014, when Mia had started school. I read the entries, the school drop-off records, the parent-teacher meeting notes, the dentist appointments, the Saturday soccer games and Sunday afternoon trips to the park and Thursday evening dinners that I had cooked because Rachel had court prep. All of it there. All of it dated. All of it, entry by entry, the record of a man who had been present. I scrolled further, back to 2012, to Mia's second year, to the period when my Ride Bridge project had been at its most demanding, and I had still, according to the record in front of me, managed to be at 41 of the 43 school events that term. I had missed 2. I had noted why I missed them and when I had rescheduled what I missed. I kept scrolling. I want you to understand something about what I was looking at. I had not built this record in order to use it. I had not kept it as a precaution or a strategy or an insurance policy against a future I could not have anticipated. I had kept it because keeping it was how I managed the complexity of a full life, how I made sure that nothing fell through, that the things that mattered were tracked, that Mia's appointments were not forgotten and her milestones were not missed. It was a tool of presence, not of protection. But as I scrolled through 11 years of entries on a Monday morning in March with the dissolution papers on the kitchen table beside me and Rachel's email still open on my phone, I understood something with a clarity that was almost physical. I had been building, without knowing it, the most complete record of a father's presence in his child's life that I had ever seen. I put the phone down. I looked out the window at the garden. I thought about Rachel's email, about emotionally unavailable, about frequent professional absences, about the specific architecture of the stories she had told our friends and would, I understood now, tell anyone who mattered. I thought about Mia, who was at school, who did not yet know that the Monday of her 14th year was the day her parents' marriage officially ended. Then I thought about my brother Liam in Auckland, who had called me 8 months ago when I had told him what I suspected about the accounts, and who had said, "Cal, whatever happens, you keep your records, you hear me? You keep everything." I had kept everything. I picked up my phone again, not to call Rachel, not to respond to the email, not to do any of the things that the hot, reactive impulse of the morning was suggesting. I called Janet Osei's office. I had found her name 3 days earlier, in the way you find things when you are preparing for something you hope won't happen but are beginning to understand will, through a referral from Liam, who had used her in an Auckland property dispute and described her in terms that I had written down because they seemed exactly right. She doesn't fight like she's angry. She fights like she's already won, and she's just waiting for the room to catch up. Her assistant answered. I gave my name. I said I needed an appointment as soon as possible. "Ms. Osei has a cancellation tomorrow at 2, the assistant said. "I'll take it," I said. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for one more moment, in the kitchen of the house I had helped buy and had maintained and had stood in most mornings for 11 years. And I looked at the dissolution papers and the phone and the window and the garden beyond it where the question had been asked and the answer had been, for months, already decided. Then I picked up the papers and the phone, and I went to work. Because the job site doesn't close because your marriage ended on a Monday morning, and because, it turned out, neither did I. Janet Osei's office was on the 14th floor of a building in the CBD, with a view of the harbor that she appeared to have stopped noticing, the way people stop noticing things that are consistently present. She was 51, Ghanaian Australian, with reading glasses that she wore on her face rather than on a chain, and a quality of stillness that I would come to understand was not passivity, but economy. The conservation of movement and word that belongs to someone who has learned that most things do not require a response and has organized her professional life accordingly. She read through everything I brought her in the first 30 minutes without comment. Then she looked up. "Tell me about the app," she said. I explained Family Hub, what it was, how I had used it, how long I had been using it. She listened with the focused attention of someone who is not just receiving information, but immediately assessing its weight and placement in a larger structure. 11 years, she said. Since 2013, I said. Consistently. She was quiet for a moment. What does it contain, specifically? I told her. The calendar entries, every scheduled pickup, every school event, every medical appointment, every family occasion. The notes I had added, brief, factual, the kind of working notes a person makes when they are managing the logistics of a family and want to be sure nothing falls through. The photographs, Mia at every significant moment in her childhood that I had been present for, which was most of them, time-stamped and geotagged in the way that photographs taken on phones are automatically documented. The financial records, the household expense tracking I had maintained because I was the one who managed our shared accounts, because Rachel's billing practice made her income variable in ways that made consistent financial planning her least favorite task. Janet looked at me for a moment. "Callum," she said, "do you know what you have?" I said I thought so. "You have the primary contemporaneous record of the family's life for 11 years, she said. Not a record you created in response to this situation, not something a court would need to assess for retrospective motivation. A record that predates this proceeding by 11 years, and that was maintained by the person Rachel is describing as absent." She paused. "The story she has told about you, emotionally unavailable, frequently absent, runs directly into 11 years of time-stamped evidence of the opposite." She opened her notebook. "I need you to export everything from the app," she said. "Every entry, every note, every photograph. We'll need it in a format that can be presented as documentary evidence. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "Good." She looked at me steadily. "I also need to understand what she has. What does Dominic Farrell know that we haven't seen yet?" I told her about Farrell, what I knew of him from Rachel's world, which was not much beyond the reputation that preceded him in Sydney family law circles. Aggressive, strategic, known for controlling the narrative early and then defending it. Rachel would have chosen him carefully. Janet nodded with the expression of someone receiving information they already possessed. "I know Dominic's work," she said, in a tone that was perfectly neutral and communicated something specific beneath the neutrality. "We'll proceed accordingly." I went home that afternoon and exported 11 years of Family Hub data onto an external drive and delivered it to Janet's office by the end of the week. What that data actually contained, in the specific numbers that Janet would later organize and present, was this: 2,847 recorded instances of Callum Burns' documented presence in activities related to his daughter's life. 341 school drop-offs and pickups. 67 parent-teacher meetings, school events, and extracurricular activities. 23 medical or dental appointments. 14 weekend excursions that appeared in the records with notes, photographs, and in several cases, receipts from the family's joint account attached. The menus of approximately 40 dinners I had cooked and recorded because I was tracking household nutrition for a period when Mia had dietary restrictions from her orthodontist. The specific timestamp of a Tuesday evening in 2021, 11:43 p.m., when I had updated the app from Westmead Hospital while Mia was sleeping after her wrist surgery, noting the discharge time and the follow-up appointment I had already scheduled. Not a record designed to win an argument. A record of a life, of presence accumulated slowly, entry by entry over 11 years, because that was how I managed the complexity of caring for the people I loved. Rachel had told our friends I was not there. I had been there 2,847 times. Dominic Farrell's first move arrived 10 days after the dissolution papers, in the form of a formal filing that was, in its structure, exactly what I should have expected from someone with his reputation. He requested primary custody for Rachel on the grounds of Callum's pattern of emotional withdrawal and professional prioritization over family engagement. He requested that Callum vacate the family home during proceedings, citing a need to maintain stability for Mia in her primary environment. He requested a psychological evaluation of both Callum and Mia to be conducted by a clinician he nominated, Dr. Patricia Webb, a child psychologist with 20 years of practice and an established professional relationship with several family law firms in Sydney. It was a clean, aggressive opening. Establish the narrative, restrict the opposition's resources, bring in an expert whose report you believe will confirm your client's position. Farrell had done this many times. He was very good at it. What happened next, I learned later, was something that Farrell had not fully anticipated. When the formal response was filed, Janet's response on my behalf with a document list attached that included the Family Hub export, Farrell's assistant brought him the filing at his desk. He read it. He looked at the document list. He saw the scope of the Family Hub material, 11 years of time-stamped data. And he went still in the specific way of someone who has just encountered something that requires recalculation. Then he saw Janet's name on the cover sheet. I know this because of what Liam told me months later, after the proceedings were finished and the people who move in Sydney legal circles had begun to talk. Farrell had tried a case against Janet Osei 14 months earlier, a substantial property dispute in a high-net-worth divorce that had been expected, on the basis of the initial evidence, to resolve in his client's favor. It had not. Jan had won it not through aggression, but through the specific, methodical dismantling of the narrative Farrell had built, piece by piece, with documentary evidence that she had spent 4 months assembling before the first hearing. Farrell had come into that courtroom confident and had left it recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the case. He had not forgotten it. When he saw her name on my filing, he paused. This is not nothing. Dominic Farrell does not pause. He moves forward, fast, with the momentum of someone who has always found momentum to be his primary instrument. A pause meant that something in the document list had given him reason to consider whether the strategy he had opened with was still the correct one. He kept the strategy. He was too far into the proceedings to change it cleanly, but he kept it with the slightly different quality of someone who knows they are in a room with a person who has beaten them before and is adjusting accordingly. Janet told me about it in our next meeting without drama. "He'll be more careful than usual," she said. "That's not bad for us. Careful is slower, and slower gives us time." I asked her how she knew. She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Because if I were him and I saw my name on that filing, I'd be more careful too," she said. That's just accurate assessment. Rachel's email worked. I want to say that plainly, without the softening that comes from wanting to believe that people see through these things more quickly than they do. The email worked because Rachel was a skilled writer of persuasive documents. It was literally her profession. And because the people who received it had no reason to doubt her and every social incentive to accept the version of events that made the situation comprehensible. A marriage had ended. One person was explaining why. The explanation was sad and measured and didn't vilify anyone directly. That is, in the social grammar of these situations, the version that gets believed. The withdrawal happened gradually. Some people were explicit. They called or texted to say they were sorry to hear it, in the tone of someone who has formed a position and is expressing condolence from within that position. A couple we had been close to for 8 years sent a message that managed to express sympathy for both of us in a way that nonetheless communicated whose account they had found more credible. The headmaster at Mia's school, who had known Rachel for years through various parent committee activities, began routing school communications through Rachel's contact information rather than the shared parental email we had used since Mia started there. This last one mattered practically. I found out about Mia's mid-year performance review from Mia herself 3 days after the meeting had occurred. I noted all of it. Not with bitterness, or not primarily with bitterness, because I am honest enough to admit there was some, but with the attention of someone who had learned, in the 3 weeks since the dissolution papers arrived, that documentation was not paranoia, but preparation. I kept a separate notebook. Paper, not digital. Something about the act of writing by hand made the entries feel more considered, less reactive. Each entry had a date, a description of what had occurred, and, wherever possible, a notation of who else had been present or could corroborate. It was not an exhaustive log. It was a working record of the patterns I was observing, the social mechanics of what was being done to the story of my marriage and my relationship with my daughter. What I was watching, I understood clearly by the 6th week, was a campaign. Not a conspiracy. I want to be precise about that distinction because it matters. A conspiracy requires coordination and malice of forethought and a darkness that I do not think was present here. What was present was something more ordinary and in some ways more insidious. A person with a clear objective, a sophisticated understanding of how narrative works in social and legal contexts, and the professional skill to execute on both simultaneously. Rachel was not orchestrating a network of people against me. She was managing her own story with the precision she brought to everything she did, and the story was spreading because good stories do. There was one moment in the 7th week that I want to tell you about. I was at the school for a pickup, one of my regular Thursday pickups, the ones I had been doing for 9 years without interruption. I was in the car park waiting for Mia when another parent, a man named Greg, whose daughter was in Mia's year and whom I had spoken to at school events for 4 years, walked past my car and stopped. We had always been on pleasant terms. He was the kind of person who made easy conversation and remembered things about your life that made you feel seen. He stopped. He looked at me. And then, with the specific awkwardness of someone who has decided not to stop but has already stopped, he nodded once and walked on. Not unfriendly, not hostile, just reduced. The nod of someone who has received information and is now managing the appropriate social distance. I sat in my car and watched him go and thought, this is what it looks like when a person you have known for 4 years decides, based on an email he received from your wife, that you are someone to be careful of. I wrote it in the notebook when I got home. Not Greg's name. His mistake was not his. It was made for him. Just the pattern, the shape of it. The way a story, once distributed, reorganizes the social world around the person it describes. The notebook went into the drawer. The drawer joined the Family Hub export and the financial records and the dissolution papers and the growing file that Janet was assembling on the 14th floor of the CBD building with the harbor view she had stopped noticing. The second meeting with Janet was different from the first. The first had been intake, information flowing in one direction, her assessing what I had and what it meant. The second was strategic, which meant it was a conversation between two people who had both done their homework and were now comparing what they had found. She had read the Family Hub export. She had gone through the financial records. She had reviewed Rachel's email and compared its specific claims against the documentary evidence. She had also, through the networks available to someone in her professional position, developed a clearer picture of Farrell's approach and what he was likely to bring. He will make this about character, she said, not about facts, because the facts don't support the story. About perception, about the experience of living with you, the emotional texture of the marriage, the quality of your presence rather than its quantity. He'll bring the marriage counselor's records and he'll use your difficult periods against you. We had hard years, I said. That's true. It is, she said, and it will be in the room. The question is, what else is in the room? She looked at me steadily. There's something I need to ask you about. I waited. In the financial review, she said, there are some transactions in the personal account Rachel opened last August that I want to understand. Some of the outflows don't correspond to household expenses or professional costs. She paused, with the careful quality of a professional who is about to say something that requires saying carefully. Is there something about Rachel's personal situation in the past 18 months that I should know? I looked at the harbor outside her window for a moment. There was. I had known about it since November, since I had found, in the way you find things when you were finally paying the kind of attention that you should have been paying earlier, the evidence of someone who had been conducting a parallel life. Not a dramatic discovery, a receipt in a jacket pocket, a name that appeared in a phone conversation she'd had in the kitchen when she thought I was asleep. The specific quality of her manner on certain Thursday evenings that I had, for months, attributed to work stress. I had known, and I had not acted on it, and I had not told anyone. Not Liam, not Dr. Harris. I had carried it alone, with the specific heaviness of information you are not ready to use because using it means accepting what it means. Yes, I said to Janet, there is something. I told her. She listened without expression. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, in the considered way of someone who is assessing not the information itself, but its implications and its cost. This is relevant, she said. It speaks to the financial behavior, the separate account, the timing of when she started moving resources, and it's something Farrell won't be expecting us to have. I don't want to use it, I said. She looked at me. Callum, Mia will read everything we file, I said. Eventually. She's 14. She's smart, and one day she'll be old enough to access the court record and she'll read every document in this proceeding. I paused. I don't want to be the person who put that in a document that Mia reads about her mother. Janet held my gaze for a long moment. Then she closed the folder. All right, she said. It was not a capitulation. It was the response of someone who has assessed the decision and found it coherent, even if not the decision she would have made. We don't use it, but I want you to understand what we're leaving on the table. I understand, I said. She picked up her pen. Then let's talk about what we do use, she said. What we used was everything else. The Family Hub export, organized and indexed. The financial records, with the timeline of the separate accounts opening compared to the timeline of the dissolution papers preparation, demonstrating that Rachel had been planning the separation for at least 8 months before filing, which contradicted the account of a woman who had been trying to address a failing marriage and had finally accepted its failure. The email to our friends, cross-referenced against the app data, with specific entries highlighted where Rachel's characterization of Callum's absence conflicted with documented evidence of his presence. And something else. Something that had been delivered to me by Liam 3 weeks earlier in the form of an audio file sent from Auckland with no message attached except a single line. Thought you'd want to hear this. She came to me on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks into the proceedings. I had moved out of the family home. Janet had advised against fighting the vacation request, calculating correctly that contesting it would cost more in judicial goodwill than the house was worth in strategic terms. I had a flat in Willoughby, a 10-minute drive from the family home and 4 minutes from Mia's school, which I had chosen for exactly those reasons. It was functional and impersonal in the way of short-term furnished rentals, and I had not tried to make it more than it was. Mia came with a school bag and a slightly guarded expression, and the quality of someone who is prepared for a conversation and is now in the approach to it. I made pasta, her preferred dinner, the one she had been eating without variation since she was 6, and we sat at the small kitchen table and talked about school and her friend Priya and the history assignment she had due on Friday, and I waited. She was like me in that way. She came to things in her own time. After dinner, she helped with the dishes, which she had never voluntarily done at home, and which she offered here without being asked, which told me something about the calculation she was making about the dynamics of this flat. And then she sat back down at the table and looked at me. "Ba," she said. She still used the Irish diminutive, the one we had inherited from my father and that my brother's kids used too. The small inheritance of a culture that arrives differently in every generation. "Can I ask you something?" "Always," I said. "Did you know this was coming?" she said. "Before it happened?" I thought about the honest answer. "I knew something was wrong," I said. I didn't know what she had planned. Mia nodded, with the expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already concluded. "I knew too," she said. "Not the legal stuff, but I knew." I looked at her, at the 14-year-old who had been in this family for the full duration of its difficulty, who had watched two people try to be married to each other from the specific vantage point of being the person whose world depended on their success. "What did you know?" I said, gently, the way you ask things you want the true answer to and are afraid of what it might be. She was quiet for a moment. "I heard some of the phone calls," she said. "From Mom. To Dominic, the lawyer. She thought I was asleep or I was in my room, but our house isn't that big." She looked at me steadily. "She talked about strategy, about what would work and what wouldn't. About you." She paused. "She's not wrong about some of it. You do go quiet sometimes. You do pull away when things are hard." "I know," I said. "But she's wrong about the important parts," Mia said. "You were always there, like actually there, not just in the building." She looked at the table. "I don't know how to explain the difference, but I know it exists." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "You don't have to be anyone's witness in this, Mia. You just have to be my daughter. That's all." She looked up at me. Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the specific release of someone who has been holding a weight they were told they might have to carry and has just been told they can set it down. "Okay," she said. She stayed for 2 more hours. We watched a documentary about migratory birds that she had seen before and wanted to show me, and she fell asleep on the couch 15 minutes before the end, and I covered her with the spare blanket and sat in the chair across from her and thought about the question Webb had asked in their first session. Who do you feel most safe with? And what a 14-year-old who had been listening through the walls of a house that wasn't that big might have said in response. 3 weeks later, I would find out. Mia had not told me what she was going to do. She had simply done it. Written a letter in her own handwriting addressed to Dr. Patricia Webb at her Neutral Bay clinic and sent it before their final session. I did not know this until after the proceedings, when Mia told me herself. She told me what she had written. Not the exact words, but the substance of it. That she wanted Dr. Webb to know that she was not a passive participant in what was happening, that she understood more than the adults in the room seemed to think she understood, and that she wanted to tell the truth and was afraid that the structure of the process was not designed to let her. Dr. Webb received the letter on a Thursday morning. Her assistant had told me, months later, that Webb had read it alone in her office, and that she had then sat still in that office for 5 minutes before she had done anything else. I can only imagine what 5 minutes of stillness looks like in the office of a woman who has been doing this for 20 years, who has sat across from hundreds of children in situations exactly like this one, and who had received, in a child's handwriting, something that cut through every professional framework she had developed for managing exactly this kind of complexity. I do not know what was in the letter. I know what Webb wrote in her report, and I know that whatever Mia said, in her own words, in her own hand, on a Thursday morning that nobody had planned or prepared or could control, it mattered. There is a particular quality to a courtroom that I had not encountered before these proceedings and that I found when I first sat in one, both more ordinary and more consequential than I had expected. More ordinary because the room itself is just a room, functional, institutional, with the slightly worn quality of spaces that are used heavily by people who are not there by choice. The carpet is practical, the lighting is fluorescent, the seats are the kind of seats that communicate that comfort is not the primary objective. Nothing about the physical space announces that what happens in it matters. It simply proceeds with the muted efficiency of a system that has been processing difficult situations for long enough that it no longer requires drama to function. More consequential because of what is said in it, because of the specific, irreversible quality of things stated for the record in a proceeding that will exist in the legal archive for decades, that can be accessed, that is real in the way that documents are real, permanent, retrievable, the official version. I thought about Mia every time I sat in that room, about the documents she would one day be able to read. I had made a decision about what I wanted those documents to contain. Not a decision made in the heat of the moment. I had thought about it carefully over the weeks of preparation, and I had arrived at something I could hold clearly. I wanted the record to show who I was, not who Rachel wasn't. I wanted to win. I want to be honest about that. I was not indifferent to the outcome, but I wanted to win by being accurately represented, not by making her inaccurate. Janet had understood this. I am not sure she agreed with it entirely, but she had understood it, and she had built the case accordingly. The Family Hub data was presented in the fourth session in the form of a formatted report that Janet's team had prepared from the export. It ran to 43 pages of organized entries, indexed by category and cross-referenced against the specific claims in Rachel's supporting documentation. It was not designed to be emotional. It was designed to be clear. Janet introduced it with the economy she brought to everything she did in that room. This is a contemporaneous record maintained by Mr. Byrne since 2013. It predates these proceedings by 11 years. I'd like to direct the court's attention to the summary on page 4. Page 4 showed the aggregate numbers, 2,847 documented instances, the categories, the proportions. Farrell had seen it in advance. Discovery requirements meant there were no surprises in that room, and he had prepared a response. His response was technically competent. He argued that the data showed quantity rather than quality, that presence in an entry didn't constitute meaningful engagement, that the app was a scheduling tool rather than a record of emotional attunement. These were fair arguments. They were the arguments available to him. But they ran into a problem that I don't think he had fully anticipated when he prepared them. The entries were not just timestamps. In 11 years of daily use, I had added notes to hundreds of entries, brief, functional notes of the kind a person writes when they are managing the practical care of a child and want to remember something that matters. The entry for Mia's hospital admission in 2021 had a note that read, "Mia slept from 9:30, pain manageable with prescribed dosage. Called school to arrange extension on Wednesday's assignment. Follow-up with Dr. Nakamura scheduled for Thursday, 14th at 11 a.m. The entry for her Year 6 graduation had a note, "Mia gave her class speech. She changed the last line from what she'd rehearsed. Said something better. I told her afterward and she was embarrassed and pleased." The entry for a Saturday in July 2018 had a note, "Mia cried in the car on the way home from soccer. Didn't want to talk about it. Sat with her in the driveway for 20 minutes. She said it was fine. It wasn't fine, but she needed to say it was. Letter." Farrell argued quantity over quality. The notes were quality, not demonstratively, not in a performed way, in the specific, unglamorous way of a parent paying attention and writing it down because writing it down was how they paid attention. Janet read several of them aloud in that courtroom. Not many, not enough to be theatrical. And the room had a quality afterward that I recognized from my professional life, from the moment on a job site when the calculation resolves and everyone present understands, without needing to be told, that the structure is going to hold. I looked at the carpet. I thought about the Ride Bridge. I thought about 40,000 vehicles a day and the specific satisfaction of a thing bearing load because the calculations were right. I thought, this is what 11 years of showing up looks like, on the record, in a room. I need to tell you about the phone call. Liam had called me in August of the previous year, 8 months before Rachel filed, on a Sunday afternoon when I had just returned from a weekend in Canberra for a project site visit, tired and slightly disconnected. The specific quality of a man who has been away and has come home to a house that feels different in a way he cannot articulate. I had told Liam what I had been noticing about the accounts, the incremental movements, small transfers, quiet and consistent, building up in a pattern that I had been explaining away and was running out of explanations for. I told him I didn't know what to do with it, that confronting Rachel felt like an accusation I might not be able to support, that doing nothing felt like complicity in something I couldn't name yet. Liam had listened with the patience of an older brother who has spent a lifetime listening to the person he knows best navigate things the person is not yet ready to navigate. Then he had said, "Cal, whatever happens, you keep your records. You hear me? All of it. Don't delete anything. Don't tidy anything up. Don't make it neat. Keep everything." I had kept everything. What I had not known when I sent Liam those emails was that Rachel would also call Liam. She called him on a Thursday evening in February, 10 weeks into the proceedings. Liam told me about it within an hour of hanging up, called me from his kitchen in Auckland with the specific quality of someone who has just had an experience they need to describe while the details are still exact. Rachel had been warm. She had been, he said, the version of herself that she was when she wanted something from a room, attentive, generous with her listening, careful about tone. She had asked about his life, about his family, with the genuine seeming interest of someone who had always been good at making people feel that their concerns mattered. She had asked about me, gently, as though she was worried about me, as though the separation had been hard for her in ways that made her think about the people around me. Then she had asked if Liam would be willing to share his honest perspective on our relationship, on the difficult years, on the times I had struggled. She had framed it as something she needed, for her own understanding, for Mia's sake, for the proceedings to reflect the full picture rather than just one side. Liam had told her he appreciated the call. He had told her he would think about what she was asking. He had thanked her for reaching out. Then he had ended the call, opened his phone's recording app, which he had turned on 3 minutes into the conversation when he had understood where it was going, and sent me the audio file with the single line, "Thought you'd want to hear this." I listened to it twice, alone, in the Willoughby flat. What I heard was Rachel, not the Rachel of the dissolution papers or the formal courtroom manner or the careful email to our friends, the Rachel of a private phone call, making a specific kind of request to a specific kind of person, using the tools she had always been best with. Warmth, attention, the implied suggestion that cooperation was the generous and correct response. It was not illegal. It was not a conspiracy. It was a person doing what they were good at in service of an outcome they wanted. But it was also Rachel speaking in a register that she did not use in rooms where the words were being recorded by an official process. And the gap between that register and the one she used in the courtroom was audible. Not dramatically, not in a way that revealed some hidden villainy, but in the way that a gap is always audible when you can hear both sides of it. Janet listened to the recording in our next meeting without expression. When it ended, she was quiet for a moment. "This goes to character and to the credibility of her account of the separation," she said. "It's not the strongest piece of evidence we have. It's a useful piece of evidence we have." "She was trying to get Liam to say something bad about me," I said. "Yes," Janet said, "and he didn't." She looked at me. "That's also in the recording." The financial documentation, the separate account, the timeline of transfers, the 8 months of quiet preparation before the filing, told a story that Farrell's narrative had not accounted for. Rachel's account of the separation described a woman who had tried to address a failing marriage and had finally, reluctantly, accepted its failure. The financial record described someone who had been preparing to leave for at least 8 months before the first document was filed, which meant that the period she had described as a genuine attempt at repair had been, at least in part, a period of simultaneous preparation for the end. These two things, the attempt at repair and the preparation for departure, are not necessarily incompatible. People are complicated. People can be trying to save something and simultaneously protecting themselves from its loss. I believe Rachel may have been doing both, but the financial record made the preparation visible, and visible preparation in the context of a legal proceeding speaks to the credibility of the account that was built on top of it. Farrell was good. He had counter-arguments for the financial material, explanations for the account opening, contextualization for the transfers. They were not implausible explanations, but they were explanations, which meant they were responses rather than positions, which meant Janet had made him spend the session defending rather than advancing. That was what Janet did. She built a room where the other side had to explain themselves. Then she let the explanations work. Dr. Patricia Webb had been recommended by Farrell, which meant Rachel had reason to trust the direction of her findings. This is not a criticism of Webb. I want to be clear about that. Expert witnesses are nominated by the parties that engage them, and this is a feature of the adversarial system rather than a corruption of it. Webb was legitimate, credentialed, with 20 years of clinical and forensic practice. She was not in Farrell's pocket. She had not agreed to produce a particular finding. She had agreed to conduct an independent assessment and report what she found. Farrell had nominated her because he had read her previous reports and believed that her methodology, her particular approach to assessing parental relationships and child welfare, would, when applied to the Byrne family, produce findings consistent with Rachel's account. He had made that assessment based on his professional knowledge of Webb's work. He had not accounted for Mia's letter. Webb met with Mia 3 times. The first 2 sessions were standard clinical interviews, the structured conversations of a professional assessing a child's emotional state, relational patterns, and expressed preferences. Mia, who had been raised by a lawyer and a man who wrote things down, was not a naive participant in these sessions. She was, according to what Webb later described in her report as her general demeanor, composed, direct, and notably aware of the context and purpose of the evaluation. The third session was different. 3 days before it, Webb had received Mia's letter, a handwritten letter on notepaper addressed directly to Webb at her Neutral Bay clinic, not through a parent, not routed through legal channels. Mia had written the address herself from the clinic's website and had dropped it in a postbox near her school. I do not know exactly what it said. Mia told me its substance later, and I have her account, but the specific words were between Mia and Webb, and I have chosen to leave them there. What Mia told me was this. She had written to tell Webb that she understood what the evaluation was for and what each side hoped it would say, that she did not want to be used as evidence in either direction, that she wanted to tell the truth about her own experience of her family, and she was not sure the sessions as structured were going to let her do that, and that she was asking Webb directly, as one person to another, to hear her. Webb read the letter on a Thursday morning in her office. She sat with it alone for 5 minutes before she did anything else. I have thought about those 5 minutes many times. about what a woman with 20 years of professional experience in the emotional complexity of children in family proceedings does with 5 minutes of stillness after reading a 14-year-old's handwritten request to be heard as a person rather than a data point. I think she heard it. The third session lasted 90 minutes rather than the standard 60. What was said in it is clinically privileged, and I will not speculate about its contents. What emerged from it was Webb's report, filed 4 weeks later, which I read in Janet's office on a Friday afternoon with the harbor visible through the window behind Janet's head. The report ran to 22 pages. It was written in the precise, careful language of clinical assessment, language that is designed to be accurate rather than compelling, that qualifies its conclusions and situates them in the appropriate professional context. Its central findings were these. Mia Byrne demonstrated secure attachment with both parents, but showed a distinctly organized and stable attachment pattern with her father, characterized by predictability, responsiveness, and consistent presence over time. The report noted that Mia's description of her relationship with her father was specific, detailed, and grounded in concrete shared experiences, which in the clinical literature is a marker of genuine relational memory rather than coached or generalized response. The report further noted that Mia had expressed some anxiety regarding interpersonal dynamics in her maternal home environment, including sensitivity to perceived strategic communication that she experienced as inconsistent with direct engagement. This was Webb's professional translation of something Mia had apparently communicated with considerably more directness in the session. The report's recommendation was equal shared custody, 50-50, with a review provision if circumstances changed. It did not recommend primary custody for Rachel. It did not describe Callum as emotionally unavailable. It described a child with 2 parents, one of whom had been consistently present in ways that the data supported and the child confirmed, and one of whom had created an environment in which the child had learned to be careful about what she said. Rachel had engaged Webb expecting a report that confirmed her account. Webb had produced a report that confirmed Mia's. Farrell read it in his office. I do not know his reaction. I was not there, and no one who was there has told me. But I know what he filed in response, which was a request for a second evaluation by a different clinician. The request was denied. The court found no grounds to override the appointed expert's findings. The report stood. I want to be precise about what Rachel got wrong, because I think precision matters here, and because the imprecise version, the version where she was simply outmaneuvered or simply unlucky or simply wrong in a way that was obvious from the beginning, misses the truth of it. Rachel got one thing wrong. One fundamental thing, and everything that followed flowed from that single error. She underestimated Mia. Not in the way of a parent who loves their child less than they should. I don't believe that, and it would be unfair to say it. In a different and in some ways more instructive way, she assessed Mia as she would assess a variable in a legal proceeding, a factor to be managed, a witness to be prepared if necessary, or, at minimum, a presence to be kept in the appropriate alignment. She assumed, on the basis of the logic that had always served her well in professional contexts, that a 14-year-old in a family separation would default to the parent with more social and institutional authority, the parent with the professional network, the parent with the school relationships, the parent whose email had shaped the community's understanding of the situation. She had not asked Mia what Mia thought. She had not, I mean this in the most specific possible sense, asked her. Not as a strategic oversight. She had not avoided the question for tactical reasons. She had simply not believed the question was necessary, because she had already decided she knew the answer. But Mia had been listening for years, had been watching for years, had developed in the specific way of a child raised in a household that contained both a man who wrote things down and a woman who managed information strategically, a particular acuity about the gap between what people said and what they meant. She had heard the phone calls. She had watched the preparations. She had sat in Dr. Webb's office 3 times and understood with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to make her understanding deniable what was being attempted and what she felt about it. And she had done something that no one in the proceeding, not Farrell, not Janet, not Rachel, not me, had anticipated or could have controlled. She had written a letter, in her own handwriting, in her own words, on notepaper from the desk in her bedroom that her grandmother had given her for her 12th birthday. She had looked up an address and put a stamp on an envelope and walked to a post box near her school on a Tuesday afternoon and posted it. And that act, that small, private, entirely unorchestrated act, had changed the proceeding in a way that all of the lawyering and documentation and strategic positioning had not. Because Webb was a professional with 20 years of experience reading children in exactly these situations. And when a child writes you a letter, by hand, asking to be heard as a person, and the letter is clear, and the reasoning is coherent, and the emotional intelligence in it is evident, a professional with 20 years of experience does not file it and proceed as planned. She sits with it for 5 minutes, and then she hears the child. Rachel had built her case on the assumption that she controlled the information in the room, that she understood who would say what and what the expert would find and how the picture would resolve. She had built it with the skill and the precision of someone who does this professionally, who knows the instruments and the outcomes and the way the system processes the inputs it receives. She had not built it to account for a 14-year-old who had decided, on her own, that the truth was worth a stamp and an envelope and a walk to a post box on a Tuesday afternoon. That is the thing about truth, in my experience. You can manage the rooms where it gets discussed. You can choose the framing and the timing and the evidence and the expert. You can build a very good case, but you cannot build a case against a child who has decided to tell what they saw. Not when the child is credible. Not when the child is specific. Not when the child has, without knowing it was significant, been paying the kind of attention that makes their account of events as detailed and grounded and real as anything in 22 pages of clinical assessment. Mia had been watching for years. She had simply, finally, been asked. The judgment came on a Thursday morning in September. I had been awake since 4, not anxiously, not the restless, spiraling wakefulness of someone who cannot manage their fear. The steady, early morning alertness of someone who is waiting for something that has been coming for a long time and has arrived. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the Willoughby flat. I watched the Sydney dark turn slowly into the gray of early morning, and then into the particular pale gold of a spring day choosing to be generous. Mia was at school. She had asked me the night before if she should stay home. I had told her no, that school was where she was supposed to be, that I would call her when I knew, that whatever happened we would talk about it that evening over pasta. She had looked at me for a moment with the expression she had, at 14, of someone who has decided to trust a person's judgment while reserving the right to have been right if it goes wrong. Then she had gone to bed. I drove to the city. I sat in the courtroom. I listened. The judgment ran to 31 pages, and the judicial officer read a summary from the bench that covered its key points in approximately 20 minutes. I listened to all of it with the attention I bring to things that matter. The focused, quiet attention of a man who has learned that the most important moments in life are the ones that reward being fully present for them. The primary custody arrangement sought by Rachel was not granted. The court found that the evidence did not support the characterization of Callum Byrne as a parent who had been consistently absent or emotionally unavailable. The Family Hub documentation was referenced specifically. The court noted that it constituted an unusually comprehensive contemporaneous record of parental engagement, and that its content was materially inconsistent with the characterization advanced in the applicant's supporting evidence. The financial timeline was noted. The court found that the preparation for separation had preceded the filing by a period that raised questions about the accuracy of the account of a marriage in which remediation was genuinely being pursued. Dr. Webb's report was cited at length. The court ordered shared custody, 50-50, week on, week off, with the family home sold and proceeds divided according to the applicable property framework, with the account discrepancy reconciled as a deduction from Rachel's share of the matrimonial assets. Not a complete victory. I want to be accurate about that because accuracy is the standard I have been trying to hold throughout this account, and this is not the moment to abandon it. I did not get everything I had wanted. I had wanted to stay in the family home, not for sentimental reasons or not only for them, but because Mia's stability mattered to me and the house was stable. The court found that the sale was appropriate, and it was, and I accepted it. The flat in Willoughby was 4 minutes from Mia's school. I knew the route by heart. It was enough. What I had wanted most, and what I had been more afraid of losing than anything else, was time. Equal time. The week-on, week-off rhythm of a shared arrangement that meant Mia would not grow up in a household that had become, by the weight of a court order, primarily someone else's. The court gave me that. It gave it because the evidence supported it, and the evidence supported it because I had been there, and I had been there because being there was what I did, and the app had been running quietly in the background of all of it for 11 years, writing it down. I called Mia at lunch. She answered on the second ring in the muffled way of someone taking a call in a corridor. "Bah," she said. 50-50, I said. Week on, week off. A pause, then, "Okay," she said. Not with the performed relief of someone delivering the expected emotional response, just, "Okay." The word of a 14-year-old who had been bracing for worse and had received something she could work with. "Pasta tonight?" I said. "Yeah," she said. "Extra garlic." "Always," I said. She hung up. I sat in my car in the CBD and I looked at the harbor through the windscreen. The same harbor Janet looked at from the 14th floor and had stopped noticing. And I stayed there for 5 minutes in the specific, grounded quiet of someone who has been through something difficult and has come out the other side in a place they can live with. Then I drove back to work. Because the job site doesn't close on a Thursday. She asked to see me alone on the Saturday of my first week. Not dramatically. She texted me on Friday afternoon, "Can we talk tomorrow, just us, before we watch anything?" I said yes. I made tea, which she had recently started drinking in the way of someone who has decided they are old enough for it and is enjoying the decision. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the mug and looked at me with the expression I had come to recognize as her working up to something expression. Composed on the surface, something more complicated moving underneath. She told me what she had seen. Not everything. I don't think she told me everything. And I don't think I needed everything. She told me the shape of it, the phone calls she had heard from her room when she was supposed to be asleep, the specific evening she had heard Rachel and Dominic Farrell discussing strategy for the first time. She described the sound of it, the way it was different from Rachel's work calls, more careful, more deliberate, the quality of a conversation being conducted at a slightly lower register than usual. She told me about the morning the email had been sent to their friends, how she had seen Rachel at the laptop at 7 in the morning, which was earlier than Rachel was usually up, and how she had read the draft over Rachel's shoulder when her mother didn't notice her standing in the doorway. She had read the draft. "Did you know she was going to send it?" I said. "I thought she might," Mia said. "I didn't know what to do with that." She looked at her tea. I wasn't going to say anything. I was going to just not say anything and hope it worked out. What changed? I said. She was quiet for a moment. Dr. Webb, she said. The first session. She asked me to describe a typical week, and I described it. School, dinners, weekends. And I realized while I was talking that the week I was describing had you in it more than it had Mum in it. Not because Mum wasn't there, because you were the one who... She stopped. She looked for the word. You were the one who was paying attention to the details. The homework, the dentist, the thing I said at dinner on a Tuesday that you remembered on a Thursday. The stuff that doesn't feel like a big deal when it's happening and that I didn't know mattered until I was sitting in an office being asked to describe it. I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table of my Willoughby flat on a Saturday morning in October. I thought about 11 years of Family Hub entries, about the note I had written at 11:43 p.m. from a hospital waiting room, about Mia cried in the car on the way home from soccer, didn't want to talk about it, sat with her in the driveway for 20 minutes. About the Tuesday evening remembered on Thursday quality of a parent who is paying attention and does not think of paying attention as anything other than the baseline expectation. I had not paid that attention in order to document it. I had paid it because it was what I understood a father to be. I wrote Dr. Webb a letter, Mia said. She said it evenly, watching my face. I know, I said. She mentioned it. Not the contents, the fact of it. Why didn't you tell me? Because if I told you, it would become part of the case, she said. And I didn't want it to be part of the case. I wanted it to be mine. I sat with that. She was 14 years old, and she had understood something about ownership and privacy and the difference between being a witness and being a person. That took most adults considerably longer to articulate. She had done something that was entirely her own, not in service of my case, not in coordination with my lawyer, not as a strategic move in a proceeding she was too young to fully navigate. She had done it because she had something to say, and she had found a way to say it. You didn't have to do that, I said. I know, she said. I wanted to. She looked up from the tea. I wanted Dr. Webb to know that I wasn't just a variable, that I had seen things and I could say what I saw. A pause. I was tired of being managed. That word, managed, landed in the kitchen with the specific weight of something precise. She had felt it. She had named it. She was 14 years old, and she had felt the difference between being engaged with as a person and being managed as a factor. And she had done something about it in the only way available to her. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers for a moment. I'm proud of you, I said. Not because of what it did for the case, because of who you are. She made a small noise that was not quite embarrassment and not quite dismissal. The sound of a 14-year-old receiving a compliment from a parent and not knowing what to do with it and choosing not to reject it. Extra garlic tonight, she said. Extra garlic, I agreed. We watched 2 episodes of the documentary series she had been working through, something about ocean ecosystems, which she was interested in with the specific consuming interest of a 14-year-old who has not yet narrowed her curiosity to a single subject and is still open to finding the whole world interesting. I made notes in the margin of my notebook while she watched because I had a drainage project in Parramatta that was giving me a problem I hadn't solved yet, and old habits. She fell asleep again before the second episode finished. I covered her with the blanket. I sat across from her in the chair and I looked at my daughter sleeping in my flat on a Saturday night, in the flat that was not the family home and was not what I had planned and was, nonetheless, where I was and where she was and where we were together, which was I had come to understand over the preceding months, the only geography that actually mattered. I thought about Rachel. I want to tell you what I thought because I think it matters, and because I have worked toward honesty throughout this account, and this is not the moment to stop. I did not think about her with triumph. I did not experience her loss as my victory in any satisfying sense. What I felt when I thought about Rachel in those months after the proceedings was something more complicated and, I think, more true. A kind of grief for the marriage that had been real for long enough that its ending deserved to be mourned, alongside an understanding that the person who had filed those dissolution papers and written that email and built that case had been operating in a mode that had, somewhere along the way, replaced the person I had loved with a professional strategy. She had not been wrong about everything. The things she had said about me, the withdrawal, the difficulty being present in the emotional rather than the practical sense, those were true things. Partial truths, used in the service of a false conclusion, but true in themselves. I had been working on them. I was still working on them. They were mine to carry and mine to address, and the proceedings had not relieved me of that. What the proceedings had done was ensure that the partial truths were not allowed to stand in for the whole truth. That was all I had asked of them. That was all I had asked. I want to end with something I have been thinking about since before any of this began. Since the Monday morning in March when I sat at the kitchen table and read the dissolution papers and the email and opened the app and understood, in the way you understand things that reorganize everything at once, that the life I had been living and the life that was being described were different things. I had spent 14 years building a marriage. Not perfectly, no one builds a marriage perfectly, and the people who tell you otherwise are either early in it or not being honest. I had built it with the materials I had: a belief in reliability, a preference for action over declaration, a tendency to show up consistently and quietly, and without requiring that my showing up be acknowledged or noted or celebrated. I am my father's son and my grandfather's grandson, and the men in my family have always believed that the work speaks for itself, and that asking for recognition of the work is a kind of weakness. I understand now that this is not entirely right. Work that is not seen is not lost. I want to be clear about that because the lesson I am drawing is not the cynical one. The 11 years of Family Hub entries did not matter because they produced a legal outcome that favored me. They mattered because they were real, because they were the actual record of an actual life lived with actual attention, and that reality persisted regardless of whether anyone was looking at it. The work I did as a father did not require documentation to have occurred. It occurred because I was there, because I was paying attention, because being there and paying attention was what I understood a father to be. But, and this is the part I had not fully understood before, being seen matters too. Not for vanity, not for the self-regarding reasons that I had always associated with wanting recognition. Being seen matters because visibility is protection. Because the absence of a record is not neutrality. It is an opening. It is the space in which another person's account of your life can expand to fill what you have left empty. Rachel had filled that space. She had done it with skill and with the professional understanding of how these things work. And she had done it in a world where my silence and my consistency and my quiet presence had left almost no visible trace for anyone but Mia and the app I had been running for 11 years without thinking about it. The app had been running for 11 years because I had needed it to manage the logistics of our family, because I am a man who writes things down, because my grandfather kept ledgers, and because the habit had passed through my father to me in the unremarkable way that habits pass, not as wisdom, not as inheritance, just as the thing you do because you saw it done and it seemed right. I had not kept the record in order to defend myself. I had kept it in order to not forget. There is a difference between those things, and the difference is important. A record kept for defense is a record shaped by anticipated conflict, and anticipated conflict shapes what you include and what you omit, and how you describe what you see. A record kept in order to not forget is a record shaped by love, by the desire to hold on to what matters, to give it enough permanence that it will still be there when you need to return to it. The family hub record was shaped by love. That was why it worked. I want to tell you about Mia, not about the proceedings, about Mia, about who she is and who she was demonstrating herself to be in the months I have been describing, and what I have learned from watching her navigate something that no 14-year-old should have to navigate. She is, it turns out, considerably wiser than I had understood. Not in the precocious, performed way of children who have been told too many times that they are mature for their age. In the quieter, more durable way of someone who has been paying attention for 14 years to the people around her, and has built, from that attention, a reasonably accurate model of how the world works and what it asks of people. She had seen what I had done. She had seen what Rachel had done. She had assessed both accounts against her own experience and her own memory, and she had found, with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to make their findings equivocal, that the accounts did not match what she had witnessed, and that she had something to say about it. The letter to Webb was not strategic. It was not, in any sense I can identify, planned. It was the act of a person who had something true to say and had found a way to say it. The most fundamental act available to anyone in any situation where the truth is being managed by people with more power than you. She had said what she saw. It had mattered. I think about that when I think about what I want Mia to carry forward from this. What I want to have modeled for her in the year that she watched her parents' marriage end in a legal proceeding that was, in many ways, a contest between two accounts of the same life. I want her to carry the understanding that what you do consistently and quietly and without requiring acknowledgement is not invisible, even when it seems like it is. That the record accumulates. That truth is findable by people who are willing to look carefully enough. And I want her to carry the corollary. That looking carefully enough is something she is capable of. That she demonstrated it. That at 14, in circumstances that were designed to manage her, she had found the one instrument that could not be managed, her own honest account, and she had used it. She had written the letter. She had walked to the post box. She had sent it. The rest had followed. I drive across the Ride Bridge sometimes in the mornings, on the way to job sites north of the river. I have driven across it 300 times since it opened, and every time I feel it, the specific chest-level satisfaction of a thing bearing load because the calculations were right, and the materials were right, and the people who built it knew what they were doing and did not cut corners. I think about the proceedings when I cross it now. About what it means to build something that holds, about the difference between a structure that looks right and a structure that is right, that has been made correctly from the ground up with attention to the things that are not visible from the outside, but that determine whether the whole thing stands or fails when the weight comes on. Rachel had built a case that looked right. What it had run into was 11 years of the actual record. 11 years of a man who had been there, written it down, and not known he was writing anything that mattered. 2,847 times. Each one with a timestamp. Each one real. Rachel had said I was not there. The app said otherwise. And Mia, who had been watching from the back seat and the hallway and the kitchen doorway for 14 years, who had listened to phone calls she wasn't supposed to hear and read email drafts she wasn't supposed to see, and sat in 3 clinical sessions with the composed directness of someone who had already decided what was true. Mia said otherwise too. Everything she said was true. Just not the she Rachel had been counting on.